They thought she was just another invisible mother trying to fit into a world that was never meant for her. But before that day ended, they would wish they had never noticed her at all. Emily Carter stepped through the tall glass doors of Westbridge Academy, the late morning sun casting soft reflections across the polished marble floors beneath her worn flats. Her simple beige cardigan hanging loosely over a cotton dress that looked modest against the sharp silhouettes of designer brands surrounding her, and in her hands she carried a homemade apple pie, still warm, its faint cinnamon scent almost out of place in a room filled with expensive perfume and quiet judgment. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the annual donor luncheon was already in full swing. Clusters of affluent mothers gathered in carefully curated circles, their laughter light but calculated, their eyes constantly scanning for status, recognition, belonging, and the moment Emily crossed the threshold, she felt it, not as words at first, but as a shift in the air, as if something unspoken had already decided she didn't belong. Vanessa Whitmore noticed her immediately, the kind of noticing that wasn't curiosity but assessment, her gaze moving slowly from Emily's shoes to the pie in her hands, pausing just long enough to form an opinion before leaning slightly toward the woman beside her, her voice low but sharp enough to travel. "I didn't realize they opened this event to the general public." And the women around her chuckled, not loudly, but just enough to make the meaning clear. Emily heard it. Of course she did. But her expression didn't change, her eyes steady as she walked forward, each step quiet, deliberate, as if she had already made peace with being underestimated. She approached the check-in table, where a young assistant glanced up briefly, hesitating just long enough to confirm what everyone else had already assumed, and before Emily could even speak her name, Vanessa appeared again, this time closer, her smile polished but hollow. "Hi there," she said, her tone coated in politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This section is reserved for donors and invited guests," her hand gesturing subtly toward the velvet rope that separated the main hall from the outer lounge, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean in, conversations lowering, eyes drifting, waiting to see how this quiet woman would respond. Emily looked at the rope, then back at Vanessa, her grip tightening slightly around the pie dish, not in anger, but in restraint, and then, without a word, she set the pie gently on the edge of the table, her movements calm, controlled, almost graceful in their simplicity, as if she refused to let the moment define her. Somewhere behind the glass entrance, the faint sound of an engine began to hum, low and steady, unnoticed by most, but just enough to signal that something, somewhere, was about to change, and as the sunlight shifted across the marble floor, casting long shadows that stretched toward Emily's feet, there was a stillness in the room, the kind that comes just before everything turns. The hum outside grew louder, no longer subtle, no longer ignorable, and though most of the room tried to maintain their polished composure, a few heads turned instinctively toward the glass entrance as the sleek black vehicle came into view, its reflection stretching across the marble floor like a quiet announcement of something far more powerful than words. Vanessa Whitmore did not turn immediately, her attention still fixed on Emily as if determined to finish what she had started, her smile tightening slightly as she leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide the edge beneath it. "I am sure you understand," she said, her tone sharpened by control. "We maintain a certain standard here. It is important for the image of the school." A few nearby mothers nodded subtly, their expressions carefully neutral but their eyes betraying agreement, and someone behind them let out a soft laugh that echoed just a little too long in the otherwise controlled silence. Emily did not respond. She simply rested her hands lightly against the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the pie dish as if grounding herself in something real, something untouched by the shifting opinions around her. Her gaze lifted briefly, not to Vanessa, but toward the entrance where the light had changed, where shadows stretched differently now, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed through her expression, not fear, not anger, but recognition. The doors opened. The sound was soft, almost respectful, yet it carried across the room with a clarity that silenced even the faintest whispers. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A server froze with a tray in hand. Even the assistant at the check-in table straightened instinctively. Footsteps followed, measured and unhurried. each one landing with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. Vanessa finally turned, her irritation flashing briefly before it was replaced by something else, something closer to calculation as her eyes landed on the man entering the room. He was not loud. He did not need to be. His presence shifted the air itself, the kind of presence that came from years of command, of decisions that carried weight far beyond a single room. A board member near the back visibly stiffened. Another woman lowered her voice mid-conversation, her posture changing without realizing it. The recognition spread slowly at first, then all at once, like a ripple that no one could stop. Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the moment unfolding around her was not unexpected but inevitable. Vanessa took a small step back, barely noticeable, but enough to break the line she had drawn just moments earlier, her confidence faltering at the edges as she watched him approach. The distance between him and Emily closed with deliberate precision, and though no words had been spoken yet, the entire room seemed to understand that whatever had been said before, whatever judgments had been made, were about to be measured against something far greater than appearances. And as he came to a stop just a few feet away, his eyes moving from Emily to the table, to the untouched pie, and then slowly to the faces surrounding her, the silence that followed was no longer polite, it was absolute. Daniel Carter did not rush, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, because in a room where status was often performed through speed and attention, his calm, measured presence felt almost unsettling, like time itself had decided to slow down around him. And when he finally stopped beside Emily, he did not speak immediately, his eyes lingering on the pie she had placed so carefully on the table, then lifting to meet hers with a quiet softness that stood in sharp contrast to the tension surrounding them. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something steady, grounded, unshaken by the noise of the room. Then his gaze shifted, not abruptly, but deliberately, moving from Emily to Vanessa Whitmore, and the moment his attention settled on her, the confidence she had worn so effortlessly began to fracture, not all at once, but in small, visible ways, the tightening of her jaw, the slight shift in her posture, the way her perfectly rehearsed smile struggled to hold its shape. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Daniel's voice finally broke the silence, low, even, and impossibly controlled. "I would like to understand something," he said, each word precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Why is my wife being asked to step away from an event she was invited to attend?" The words landed with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment, Vanessa did not respond, her mind racing to catch up with what was happening, to reconcile the image she had formed of Emily with the reality now standing in front of her. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a hint of the uncertainty she was trying to conceal. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said, her tone shifting rapidly from condescension to cautious politeness. "We simply have guidelines in place for certain areas of the event." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably firm, and when she finished, he glanced briefly around the room, taking in the faces, the subtle reactions, the silence that had replaced the earlier whispers, and then his eyes returned to her. "Guidelines," he repeated quietly, as if considering the word itself, and then he nodded once, slowly, before speaking again. "It is interesting how often guidelines are used to define who belongs and who does not." The statement was not loud, but it carried, reaching every corner of the room, and several people shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of his presence. Vanessa attempted a small laugh, one that did not quite land, her hands coming together in front of her as if to regain control of the moment. "I assure you, we treat all parents with respect," she said quickly, her eyes flicking toward Emily and then back to Daniel, searching for some sign of agreement, some indication that the situation could still be contained. But Daniel did not respond to her reassurance. Instead, he took a small step closer to the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the pie dish, a gesture so simple yet so deliberate that it drew every eye in the room. And when he looked up again, there was a clarity in his expression that left no doubt about what was coming next, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding, and everyone in that room could feel it. The quiet shift from explanation to exposure, the moment where polite words would no longer be enough. And as the silence deepened, stretching just long enough to make every heartbeat audible, it became clear that whatever came next would not only define the situation, but redefine the people standing within it. Vanessa's smile faltered completely now, not because she lacked words, but because she realized too late that none of them would carry the same weight anymore. And for the first time since Emily had walked into the room, the balance had shifted in a way she could not control, could not soften, could not dismiss with a polite excuse or a carefully chosen phrase. Daniel's hand remained lightly resting against the edge of the pie dish, his fingers still, grounded, as if anchoring the moment in something real, something untouched by status or perception. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the silence around him amplified every syllable. "Respect is not a guideline," he said calmly, his eyes steady on Vanessa. "It is a choice." The words landed differently this time, not as a question, not as a request for clarification, but as a quiet conclusion that left no room for interpretation, and a subtle ripple moved through the room as people shifted their weight, their earlier certainty dissolving into something far less comfortable. Vanessa drew in a small breath, her posture straightening as she attempted to regain composure, her tone now measured, careful, almost rehearsed in its attempt to recover control. "Of course," she replied quickly, "and we value every family here. I believe this situation has simply been misunderstood." But even as she spoke, her eyes flickered briefly toward the other mothers, searching for support that was no longer there, because one by one, the women who had stood beside her only minutes ago had stepped back, their silence now protective, distancing, as if they were already rewriting their place in the moment. Daniel watched this without interruption, his expression unchanged, and then, slowly, he turned his gaze beyond Vanessa, toward the broader room, toward the administrators standing near the far wall, toward the board members who now seemed far more attentive than before. "I would agree," he said evenly, "that something has been misunderstood." A pause followed, deliberate, precise, stretching just long enough to draw every eye back to him, to hold the room in place before the next words arrived. "Because when I committed to supporting this institution," he continued, "it was with the understanding that it represented more than prestige, more than appearance, more than selective inclusion." The weight of that statement settled immediately, heavier than anything said before, and a quiet murmur passed through the back of the room before being quickly silenced again. Vanessa's composure cracked further, her hands tightening together, her voice softer now, uncertain. "We appreciate your support, truly," she said, her words careful, her tone shifting towards something closer to apology, though she had not yet fully admitted it. "This is not reflective of our values." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it, and then his gaze returned briefly to Emily, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who stood with the same quiet steadiness she had carried from the moment she entered, her dignity intact in a way that required no defense. "Values," Daniel repeated quietly, as if considering the word again, and then he looked back at Vanessa, at the room, at the silent witnesses who now understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "They are not defined by statements," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "They are revealed by actions." The room went still again, deeper this time, heavier, because there was no longer any illusion left to hold on to, no polite explanation that could erase what had already happened, and as the sunlight shifted once more across the marble floor, casting longer shadows that reached toward the gathered crowd, it became unmistakably clear that this was no longer a moment that could be managed, but one that would have consequences far beyond the walls of that room. No one moved, and that was the moment the truth became undeniable, because silence like that did not come from confusion. It came from recognition, from the quiet realization that something irreversible had already taken place, and Daniel Carter understood it perfectly. He withdrew his hand from the pie dish slowly, not as a gesture of dismissal, but as if he had already made his decision long before anyone else realized what was at stake. And when he straightened, there was a finality in his posture that shifted the room once more, not louder, not more dramatic, but deeper, more permanent. "When I agreed to partner with this institution," he said, his voice calm, measured, leaving no space for interruption. It was because I believed it was building something meaningful for the next generation, not just academically, but in character, in values, in the way people are treated when no one thinks it matters. The words settled heavily, pressing against the polished image the school had spent years cultivating, and in the background, one of the administrators took a hesitant step forward, as if sensing the need to intervene. But Daniel did not look at him, did not acknowledge the movement, his focus unwavering. But what I see today, he continued, his tone unchanged, is something very different. Vanessa's breath caught slightly, her composure now held together by little more than instinct, her voice softer than before, almost careful. Mr. Carter, please, I assure you, this is not how we normally operate, she said, her words quick, searching. If there has been any offense, we can address it privately and make it right. The suggestion hung in the air, an attempt to contain the situation, to move it away from the watching eyes. But Daniel shook his head once, a small, decisive motion that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. No, he replied quietly. This is exactly the kind of moment that should not be handled privately. A murmur spread through the room again, quickly silenced, but impossible to ignore, and Vanessa's expression tightened as she realized that control was no longer within her reach. Daniel turned slightly then, not away from her, but toward the broader room, toward the parents, the staff, the silent witnesses who had watched everything unfold without stepping in, and when he spoke again, it was no longer directed at one person, but at all of them. Because the way people are treated when they are underestimated, he said, his voice steady, carrying clearly across the marble floor. That is the truest measure of any community. No one argued. No one even shifted. The weight of his words held them in place, forcing reflection where moments ago there had only been judgment. Vanessa's eyes dropped briefly, her confidence now replaced by something closer to unease. And for the first time, she glanced toward Emily, not with dismissal, but with the awareness of what she had misjudged. Emily, however, had not changed, her posture still calm, her expression composed, her silence intact, as if she had never needed this moment to define her worth in the first place. Daniel looked at her once more, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, and then he turned back to the administrators, his decision now unmistakably clear. Effective immediately, he said, his tone firm but controlled. All ongoing discussions regarding my investment in this institution are on hold. The words landed with finality, sending a visible ripple through the leadership standing at the edge of the room, their carefully maintained composure cracking under the implications. And though no one spoke, the impact was immediate, undeniable, and as the silence returned once more, heavier than before, it carried with it the unmistakable understanding that what had just been revealed was only the beginning of consequences none of them had anticipated. The words did not echo, but their impact did, spreading through the room in a way no one could contain. Because the moment Daniel Carter placed his investment on hold, the illusion of control that had once defined the space began to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle, unmistakable ways that only those who understood power could recognize. One of the senior administrators stepped forward at last, his expression tight, his voice carefully measured as he attempted to regain footing in a situation that had already shifted beyond his influence. Mr. Carter, perhaps we should discuss this in a more appropriate setting, he said, gesturing slightly toward a private office down the hall, his tone respectful but edged with urgency, as if proximity to privacy could somehow restore what had already been lost. Daniel did not move. He did not even glance toward the direction offered. Instead, his attention remained where it had always been, on the truth of the moment, on the quiet imbalance that had been exposed in front of everyone. An appropriate setting, he repeated softly, his eyes steady, would have been before she was made to feel unwelcome in a place meant for families. The administrator hesitated, the weight of those words settling visibly across his shoulders, and behind him, the staff who had once moved with quiet confidence now stood uncertain, their posture reflecting a reality they could no longer ignore. Vanessa Whitmore, who had once commanded the room with effortless authority, now found herself at its center for an entirely different reason. Her composure reduced to fragments she could no longer piece together, her voice absent where it had once been quick, sharp, certain. She glanced again at Emily, and this time, there was no judgment in her eyes, only the unmistakable recognition of what she had failed to see before. But Emily did not return the look, her gaze calm, distant, untouched by the shifting dynamics around her, as if her sense of self had never depended on their approval to begin with. A quiet murmur began near the back of the room, low and hesitant, as other parents exchanged glances, their earlier confidence dissolving into reflection, into discomfort, into the realization that silence had made them part of something they had not intended to own. Daniel took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but as if marking the transition from exposure to consequence. And when he spoke again, his tone carried the same steady clarity, but now with a finality that left no doubt about what would follow. "This is not about a single moment," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "It is about a pattern, one that reveals itself in small decisions, in quiet exclusions, in the way people are measured before they are known." The room remained still, every word landing with deliberate precision, and somewhere near the entrance, the faint sound of the outside world continued, distant, indifferent, as if reminding them that while this moment felt contained, its impact would extend far beyond these walls. The administrator swallowed, his voice softer now, almost careful. "We will address this immediately," he said, though the assurance felt thinner than it might have before, less convincing in the face of what had already been seen. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting its comfort, and then, finally, he turned slightly toward Emily, his presence softening just enough to reflect something deeper than authority, something grounded in respect, in recognition, in the quiet understanding that she had carried her dignity through every second of the ordeal without needing anyone to defend it for her. And as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, it became clear to everyone present that what had been exposed in that room was not just a moment of misjudgment, but a reflection of something far more enduring, something that could not be undone with words alone. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt heavy with consequence, the kind that settles into a room when everyone understands that something irreversible has already been set in motion. And as Daniel's words lingered in the air, the carefully constructed image of Westbridge Academy began to fracture in ways that could not be hidden behind polished statements or practiced smiles. The administrator standing closest to Daniel adjusted his posture, his confidence replaced by a controlled urgency, his voice now stripped of its earlier authority as he tried once more to regain direction. "We will make this right," he said, his tone deliberate, as though repetition alone could restore trust. But the words did not carry the same weight anymore, not after what had already been revealed in front of everyone. Daniel did not challenge him. He did not need to. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the meaning to settle, for the room to absorb what accountability truly required. And then his gaze shifted once more, not toward power, not toward authority, but toward the quiet center of it all. Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the unease surrounding her. And in that moment, it became clear that she had never been the one out of place. A mother standing near the back, who had earlier shared in the quiet laughter, now stepped slightly forward, her voice hesitant, almost uncertain as she spoke. "I think we all may have misjudged the situation," she said softly, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, as if searching for a way to reconcile her earlier actions with the reality now unfolding. Another parent nodded beside her, the ripple of acknowledgement spreading slowly, not as a coordinated response, but as individual realizations taking shape, one by one, each person confronting their role in what had happened. Vanessa Whitmore remained still, her earlier confidence now completely replaced by a quiet awareness that she could not undo what had been done, her gaze no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but reflective. As if she were seeing the moment from a distance she could not bridge. Daniel observed all of this without interruption, his expression measured, not driven by anger, but by clarity, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, one that moved beyond exposure and into something more enduring. "What matters now," he said, his words steady, "is not how quickly this is corrected, but how honestly it is understood. The statement settled deeply, shifting the focus from reaction to reflection, from immediate repair to lasting change, and for the first time, the room felt less like a place of performance and more like a place of consequence. Emily finally moved, not dramatically, not with urgency, but with quiet intention, stepping slightly forward as her hand rested gently on the edge of the table where her pie still sat untouched, and for a brief moment, all eyes followed her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect that had arrived too late, yet could not be ignored. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence carried more weight than anything that had been said, because it was not built on reaction, but on something far more grounded, something that had remained intact long before the room had changed around her. And as the light from outside shifted once more across the marble floor, softening the edges of the space that had once felt so rigid, it became clear that the lesson unfolding in that moment was no longer controlled by those who had tried to define it, but by the quiet dignity of the one they had failed to see. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, because what had once been a carefully maintained environment of status and quiet judgment had transformed into something far more exposed, far more honest. And as Emily's hand rested gently on the edge of the table, the simple pie she had brought now carried a weight no one could ignore, a quiet symbol of everything they had failed to value when it mattered most. Vanessa Whitmore finally stepped forward, not with the confidence she once carried, but with a measured hesitation that revealed more than any words could hide, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Mrs. Carter," she began, her tone careful, almost unfamiliar to those who had heard her before, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain, as if even she did not fully recognize them. And for a moment, no one reacted, because apologies in that room had never been meant for moments like this. Emily turned her head slightly, acknowledging the voice, but her expression remained composed, unchanged, not dismissive, but not seeking validation either, and that quiet restraint made the moment even heavier. Vanessa continued, her gaze steady now, though her posture still carried the weight of realization. "I made an assumption," she said, each word deliberate, "and I allowed that assumption to define how I treated you." A few parents nearby lowered their eyes, the reflection spreading again, not forced, but unavoidable, and even the administrator who had spoken earlier remained silent, understanding that this was no longer about institutional response, but personal accountability. Daniel stood beside Emily, not intervening, not guiding the moment, but allowing it to unfold as it should, his presence still grounding the space without overpowering it. And when Vanessa finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with expectation, with the question of what came next. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying a quiet clarity that matched everything about her presence. "It was not just an assumption," she said gently, her words measured, not accusatory, but precise. "It was a decision." The distinction settled deeply, more impactful than any raised voice could have been, and Vanessa's expression shifted again, the realization sharpening as she understood the weight behind those words. Emily's gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not judging, but acknowledging the space, the people, the moment as it was. "And decisions," she continued softly, "have consequences, whether we see them immediately or not." No one spoke. No one moved. The truth in her words did not invite defense. It did not demand reaction. It simply existed, undeniable, and in that stillness, something changed once more, not in the structure of the room, but in the way it was felt. Daniel glanced at Emily then, a subtle nod passing between them, not as approval, but as recognition, as respect for the way she had carried herself through everything without needing to raise her voice or demand acknowledgement. Vanessa lowered her gaze briefly, her composure no longer something she tried to rebuild, but something she understood she had lost, and for the first time, the room no longer revolved around status or perception, but around something far more grounded, something that could not be purchased, displayed, or controlled. And as the light from outside softened across the marble floor, the space itself seemed quieter, not because it had been emptied, but because it had been changed, reshaped by a moment that no one would forget, not for its confrontation, but for what it revealed about who they had been and who they now had to choose to become. The room did not return to what it had been, and perhaps it never could, because once something true is revealed, it leaves a mark that no amount of silence can erase. And as Emily's words settled into the space, there was no longer any confusion about what had happened, only a quiet understanding of what it meant. The polished image of Westbridge Academy still stood around them. The marble floors, the glass walls, the carefully arranged tables, but it no longer felt the same, because the illusion behind it had been lifted, not by force, but by clarity, by a moment that could not be undone. Daniel Carter stood beside Emily, his presence steady, no longer shifting the room, but anchoring it, allowing everything that had been exposed to remain visible, and for the first time since he had entered, he did not speak, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to correct. The truth had already done its work. Vanessa Whitmore remained where she stood, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stillness, not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from reflection, from understanding that some moments cannot be rewritten, only learned from. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in the room knew that what had happened would follow her beyond this day, not as punishment, but as a reminder. The other parents stood in thoughtful silence, their expressions softened, their earlier certainty replaced by something more honest, more aware, and one by one, their attention shifted away from status, away from appearances, towards something far more meaningful, something they had nearly overlooked. Emily gently lifted the pie from the table, her hands steady, her movements calm, as if reclaiming something that had always belonged to her, and without a word, she turned slightly toward the exit, not out of retreat, but with quiet intention, her dignity intact, untouched by the moment that had tried to define her. Daniel followed beside her, not leading, not shielding, but walking with her, equal in presence, equal in respect. And as they moved toward the glass doors, the room remained still, watching, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because in that moment, they were not witnessing departure, they were witnessing something far more lasting. As the doors opened and the sunlight welcomed them back into the world beyond, the contrast was clear. The air outside felt open, unmeasured, free from the quiet judgments that had filled the room behind them. And as the doors closed softly, the silence inside lingered, heavier than before, not empty, but full of understanding. No one rushed to speak. No one attempted to reclaim control, because they all knew, in that quiet, that respect is not proven through status, not earned through appearance, and not granted through assumption. It is revealed in the moments when it is easiest to withhold and hardest to admit. And that day, in a room built on appearances, dignity did not ask for attention. It simply stood, unshaken, until the world finally saw it. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.